Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The political ambitions of an obscure religious leader in a remote region of Pakistan may seem to have little to do with world affairs in this era of tension between East and West. In fact, it's enormously important to understand the forces at play in an epical conflict in one of Pakistan's territories, where governmental powers must contend with regional loyalty to tribal codes. For Westerners, the rugged, fierce terrain of Waziristan may be the refuge of dreaded terrorists. For the government of Pakistan, it is an administrative challenge. But for its native tribes of Wazirs and Masouds, it is an ancient, revered, and contested homeland. My guest is Akbar Ahmed, author of Resistance and Control in Pakistan. Akbar, welcome back to Dialogue.
Great to be back, George.
It's always a pleasure to have you. And for this discussion, Akbar, in addition to being the author of the book, you bring twin talents we're going to make great use of, both as an scholar, an academic, an anthropologist, to be certain, and as an actor in our story in the sense that you were a political agent and witnessed much of what we're going to be talking about. I thought, Akbar, the most striking sentence in the book comes early on when, if I recall it correctly, there's a statement to the effect that the writ of the Pakistan government runs roughly 100 yards to either side of the main road in Waziristan. And it must, I assume, that must have been true also of the British Empire before it. That seems to speak powerfully to the influence of tribal codes.
Yes, George, that symbolizes what is the reality on the ground, which is that tribal authority is supreme, tribal law, tribal custom supreme. And the central government, which in this case is Pakistan, which half a century earlier was the British government, the imperial authority of the British, was really restricted to the main central road and 100 yards on either side, and that was it. Now, people don't fully understand this because after September 11, there was immense pressure on Pakistan to go charging into this area and look for terrorists and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of people, including, it was rumored, Osama Binladen. Pakistan was finding it very difficult because never in its history had the Pakistan army gone in large numbers in a military excursion, and this is what happened a few months ago in the year 2004.
Well, you know, as you explain it very, very eloquently here, Akbar, and in the book, the reader immediately gets that sense that it's not an easy proposition for the government to deal with these territories.
It isn't, George, for several reasons. The tribes, you mentioned the Wazir and Masood. Now, for most Americans, these names mean nothing. But for the British, these were the toughest tribes in a very tough area of the world. This was the part of the world where they had more troops in Waziristan alone than the rest of the entire Indian subcontinent, which is a remarkable figure. This was the place where an entire British brigade, just think of the number, what I'm going to say, was just wiped out.
Right.
In a classic ambush. They had just wiped out an entire British brigade, unheard of.
I think there are quotes of British officers calling them, quote, the hardest people.
Yes, yes, the toughest people in the world. And then, of course, the terrain. You see, so when you have tough tribesmen backed by the terrain, terrain means high mountains, deep ravines, inaccessible valleys, and then the international border. So if pressure is put from this side, when I was in charge of Waziristan, if I was after, say, an outlaw or murderer, I wanted to get him, he'd just cross over into Afghanistan. And this is what they're doing now.
Right.
When pressure is put by American troops in Afghanistan, they slip into Pakistan. And if it's put from Pakistan's side, they slip into Afghanistan.
You know, another aspect of this that's very important, Akbar, also comes to life early in this book, and that is the code that governs all or affects all, the social code and governing code, or Pukhtunwali, which seems to me in many ways more powerful than any government edict.
Exactly.
What is Pukhtunwali?
Again, George, this is a very important question, and I hope our viewers listening to this will appreciate that this really explains how society functions. It's a key. It's a key to opening that tribal society. Pukhtunwali simply means the way of the Pukhtuns, the code. And every tribal society, whether they were Native Americans living here in the United States of America or many societies in Africa and Asia, have a code, a cultural code, whereby people learn to conduct their lives, marriage, death, birth, all the rites de passage that societies have to go through. Industrialized societies, post-industrial societies, very often like people living in the United States, tend to go by different codes. They're no longer tribal, quote unquote.
Right.
The Pakhtuns or the Pashtuns, which is people in Afghanistan, North Pakistan, the Baloch in Pakistan, people in the Middle East, people in Iraq, for instance, many of these groups still abide by a code. And the code rests on 2 or 3 features. The first feature is a sense of honor.
Right.
Honor is very important, as understood locally. Revenge, very important. Hospitality, again very important, elements of the code. Mm-hmm. And then a remarkable feature of the code, which is nanavati, which means if you approach someone, you're being hunted by the law, you escaped for some kind of problem, and you escape into, say, I come to your home and I say, George, I want nanavati, sanctuary, if you remember, from the old media. Then you protect me according to the code. You may not like me very much, but you'll have to protect me. Now, that is why when, if you recall a few years back, America, along with Pakistan, demanded that Osama bin Laden be handed over and thrown out of Afghanistan, the Taliban government, and they were a dreadful government, no tears for their having gone, but they hung on to the code.
Because they couldn't violate that code.
They believed in Pukhtunwali, so they could not violate the code of the Pushtun, which is you look after the guest. So they may not have liked him very much. In fact, the reports are they did not, but they could not
had to obey the code.
Yeah.
You know, it's very interesting, Akbar, that at that point in this story and in your life, when you become the political agent, you make, I thought, very wise use of this, because you deal with some very sensitive cases, and I think the protection of honor in each instance seemed to be central to it. Let me investigate a couple of more phrases, if I might. The very word political, which we, of course, we use in English with its obvious meaning, comes into play here as well. I think the pronunciation there is potikal.
Yes.
But how does the political, or potikal, get integrated with Pukhtunwali in terms of how people see politics in this?
Again, a very good question. The British arrived in this part of the world, and in some senses, the Americans are in their shoes right now. The Americans have arrived, absolutely. They're in Afghanistan, they're along the borders here, they're in the Middle East. Now, the British came up with perhaps one of the most brilliant administrative arrangements in human history, which was the tribal areas. They appointed political officers. They were called political officers, but this was the elite of the British Empire. These were really the finest officers anywhere in the British Empire. And there were only 6 or 7 of them. There were 6 agencies at one stage. And the best, the most difficult, the most turbulent agency was considered South Waziristan. And South Waziristan at one stage was administered directly by Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India. This is how important it was. The political agent called the agent to the Governor General, not agent in the sense of the FBI or a CIA agent, but agent to the Governor General, represented all administrative authority. So he was described as part governor, part ambassador, and he had the authority, and this is a very important point for any administrators or policy people listening in terms of America's relations with the Muslim world. He had the authority to deal with the peoples in that area. He could deal with them through, on the one hand, the stick, and on the other hand, the carrot. So a mixture of carrot and stick, and he could then administer and make sure that those areas were calm, that there was stability. Because if he failed, the eruption from that area would have an impact on the settled areas.
It seems to me that these arrangements, which began with the British, and you point out, and of course a lot of this you inherited in a very personal
Pakistan,
way, as acting as a political agent, stress the sensitivity, the delicacy, the tinderbox nature of actions, any activity, political activity in this area. A couple of other words, if we could, Akbar, just to get into our story. Tabur Wali comes into this. Now, the people, the wazirs and the mashuds, as I understand them, share an ancestry to a great degree, but they're very distinct, very, very different in many ways. But there's a Tabur Wali I interpreted as a phrase that has, among other things perhaps, a lot to do with rivalry.
Yes. Tabur Wali simply means the code of the cousin. Now again, in traditional societies, here's a paradox. Cousins are very close. They're like brothers, they're like friends. But there's also a rivalry all the time for political leadership, for perhaps marriage, for land. So there's always an innate rivalry between cousins. So Tabur Wali is an entire code that develops around the notion of cousin rivalry, what anthropologists would call agnatic rivalry. So we had to, as political officers, negotiate the landscape. Now, if you do not know the terms, if you do not know how to play this game, if you do not know the cultural landscape, you are going to be in very serious trouble very quickly.
Right.
And I would have urged any administrator in Afghanistan, in Iraq, American administrator, to very quickly begin reading up on anthropology. And there's some great work in anthropology written by American anthropologists like Louis Dupree, who worked in Afghanistan, my own work in the tribal areas of Pakistan, where you then have a key to open that particular society.
It seems that those keys are absolutely essential because one can quickly run roughshod into a lot of trouble if you don't know them. And one of the keys, I think, would be to understand nikat.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
nikat, again, I think has a kind of a genealogical derivation, does it not?
Yes.
But what does it mean?
Again, nikat comes from nika, which is grandfather or ancestor. Absolutely crucial in tribal society, because tribal societies, unlike westernized modern societies, tribal societies rest on the notion of genealogy, which means that we have a relationship based on our ancestry. And that is where nikat comes in. So therefore, you know what you inherit, I know what I inherit. And there's an instinctive recognition of your rights and my rights for leadership, for land, for marriage, for all what makes life what it is.
Right.
And it provides a kind of stability in that society. I mean, you must remember, George, that tribal societies were described by anthropologists as ordered anarchy. So there's great order because of these checks and balances, and yet there's an anarchy, because while we may be cousins, while you recognize your rights and I recognize my rights, at the same time I'm trying to oust you and take over your political leadership. So that's where the anarchy comes, and I play all kinds of dirty tricks, and so do you.
Yeah, that's a wonderful introduction for what I would call the crux of our story. Let me introduce now our protagonist, because we have a young mullah, a religious figure who comes to head a mosque in the region, who is a man of uncommon ambition, and I would suspect a rather cunning person in many ways. And he, to make a very complex story somewhat simple, decides to use his position as a power base to gain more power, to gain more influence for the wazirs or the mashuds, and to really, I thought, undermine the authority of the political agent. All these things are his goals. But before we get further into his story, Akbar, is it important for us as Westerners, as outsiders, to understand this not as people who are Muslims doing things rather than as men who are following the dictates of the Islamic faith and what they do?
Yes, it's very important, because not everything that a Muslim does is dictated by Islam. So a Muslim may commit murder, he may commit dacoity, loot, terrorism. That's not dictated by Islam. But unfortunately, very often in the West, people tend to use a broad brush to describe every activity as quote-unquote Islamic. And this case is significant because you have picked up the story of the mullah. Again, there are echoes in the story of Osama bin Laden, because here's a very, you use the word shrewd, cunning fellow who manipulates, in a sense, religious leadership within his society and manipulates the tribe into believing in his powers, religious powers. If you recall the story, he gets one of these seeing eyes in the door, and he installs it in the door, and he has this gathering inside the room, and he goes up to the door and he looks out and he says, a guest is coming, and he says, my powers tell me that a guest who's 6 foot tall with a long beard is about to visit us. And there's a knock on the door opens, and there's the guest with the...
And everyone ascribes magical powers to him.
Magical powers, because at that stage, no one had seen or heard of one of these eyes. What do you call them? These things in the doorway.
Viewers.
Viewers, yes, the viewers. He does the same with the radio. He bans the radio and then listens to the radio and can then pronounce if it's going to rain tomorrow or not rain tomorrow. And again, people say he's got magical powers. Now, in some senses, you're seeing that happening throughout the Muslim world. Now, the nub of this issue, the dilemma, the crux is, who speaks for Islam? Is it that religious figure? Was it me as political authority representing central government and a modernizing tendency in society? Or was it the traditional chief, the traditional tribal chief?
Akbar, one of the words you used in your answer reminded me of something I wanted to ask you, and this is the right time to do it. In addition to trying to get the upper hand over Mashoud, in addition to contesting the power of political agents like yourself and the power of the Pakistan government, was one of the mullah's enemies or targets modernity itself?
Yes, it's a very interesting relationship that religious people have with modernity. There's an ambiguity here. They want to use modernity for their own purposes, as we saw in this particular case, the use of the radio, for instance, the clandestine use of the radio. And at the same time, in public, they would want to condemn it as external to Islam. And you see that tension, and you see that tension once again in our own times, and you see this again and again in stories coming from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right. So what we have here on the part of the mullah is the manipulation of religion for his purposes. The mullah's name, of course, is Nur Muhammad. And I thought the most striking point in the book, Akbar, and where his machinations, I thought, come to full fruition, is when he tries to seize the timber trade,
Yes.
which is a very lucrative source in this of income in this area. And again, to somewhat abridge our story, at this point I thought he overreached.
Yes.
And the powers of the government eventually have to bring him to justice.
Yeah, yes, exactly, because he was now disrupting not only traditional tribal leadership, but also economic structures and patterns in that agency. And they then have ramifications outside the agency. And what you saw was that while he was building up his power base, and remember that he does create a power base, the wazir in particular really look up to him, because when I took over after this whole episode had blown over, I came across a very surly, a very hostile wazir population, and that's a very dangerous thing in that part of the world, because they stretch into Afghanistan.
Exactly.
And they're a very tough tribe, as we've discussed. So somehow I had to sort of win them back. And that is the large tribe. Waziristan is called after the Wazir tribe. And I found that the respect they had for him was enormous. So I had to sort of put that aside and then begin the process of trying to win over the tribe itself. So the battle, as far as I was concerned, was to win the hearts and minds of the Wazir tribe.
Right.
And to win hearts and minds, George, I realized that you can use your troops. I had the Waziristan scouts, I had the Khasidars, all these troops were directly under the political agent. Some of them were he was in command of them, for the Khasidars, for example. You could use that as a show of force. You could use it to blow up houses or blow up people and so on. Or then you could emphasize the hearts and minds through cultural acts. And this is what I did. I realized that they had already been agitated enough, wounded enough, and I had to use this second strategy.
Well, this is what I alluded to earlier, because this second strategy in the 5 specific cases you mentioned here, where you had to act based upon what you had learned, really did seem to me to stress your need to use sensitivity.
Yes.
That the activities of the political agent had become very, very sophisticated because of what had gone on. And in this sense, Akbar, here's something else that struck me as a challenge to you and to the government. Even when Nur Muhammad, the mullah, overreached, even when the government said this is enough, this man must be dealt with, he goes to jail, his charisma, even in prison, remained at an all-time high.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this again, George, we're constantly making a comparison to our own times. You have the situation of Osama bin Laden, who in some senses resembles this particular case. He's on the run. He's wanted on all kinds of terrorist lists, the #1 wanted man in the world. And yet, to millions and millions of people, he is an icon. He's a cultural icon.
Right.
This is the sad reality that we face. So how do you deal with him? In my own case, as far as the mullah in Waziristan was concerned, I had to deal with, again, the population to convince them that there is an alternative. There's an alternative way of looking and living with reality. And that is to come to terms with central authority, to present your argument, your problems, and hopefully come up with a solution, which was not based in force and violence.
Right. Let's reverse that for a moment. You mentioned Osama bin Laden, and actually he certainly does occur to me. Also the gentleman in Iraq, al-Sadr.
Al-Sadr, yes.
Very
all
much the
yes.
same kind of
Again, George,
personality.
traditional authority. You see, if you analyze it like this, which I do in this book, who speaks for Islam? Is it traditional authority? So you're mentioning Sadr, for instance, traditional authority. The mullah in Waziristan, traditional authority. Is it central government? Central government would be Saddam Hussein, the centralized party, centralized structure, or today Alawi, or the coalition troops, Paul Bremer a few months ago. Or then tribal, traditional, lineage-based leadership. And these three are the big features in society, and you need to understand this in order to be able to negotiate between these three. You cannot completely dismiss any of these.
Right. These
All
are
of
the
them
forces in play.
Forces in play, and
you
they're
have
on
to
the table.
understand how to-
Yeah,
how to
absolutely.
deal with
They're on
them.
the table. They're
Right.
there.
Now, you had to do that on the ground as a person dealing with the tribes themselves in terms of their relation to the government.
Yes.
Now, what would you counsel the government to do in terms of its relation to them?
I would, because I represented government, would reach out, because the political agent does have great authority. He's got virtually a blank check in that part of the world. As I said, they are handpicked. This is the cream of the cream in terms of administration. I did reach out. I took risks. One of the major things I did was to go into an area called Birmal, which had never ever been visited by any political officer, including the British, and which is saying a lot, because they had taken armies all over the place and then come out very quickly. And I did this taking a huge risk by not going as the head of the administration, but going as a guest of the Wazir tribe. So I was playing on the code. I was saying, I'm coming as your guest. I'm now your guest. You can shoot me, you can hijack, you can take me as hostage, you can behead me, you can do what you want to, but I'm your guest, and that will be a reflection on your honor. So I was reversing the code of honor on them, and they treated me with great honor, because they were aware that if something happened to me, their reputation in the entire tribal areas would be finished among their own people, in their own eyes.
But what you're saying then is you were personally doing this on behalf of the government, but what the government must do is respect the code, not obstruct the code.
Respect the code and play through the code, because the code will be there. You see, George, governments come and go. Governments change. The bureaucrats running governments go with the next administration. The code stays. It has been there for 2,000 years. It'll be there as long as we can predict. Now, recognizing this, how do you then deal with people? For example, let me give an example. We had the example of some young American soldiers, and I thought I must compliment them. Being ordered to go into, say, a mosque, someone shoots from a mosque in Iraq, what do? No one has trained them for this. They don't get lessons in anthropology. They get lessons in military warfare. Yet they were sensitive enough to realize that if they go charging into a mosque, they could exacerbate, they could heighten the tension. And therefore I give them full marks, because they pulled back. You remember there were many instances when they deliberately drew a line and said, we are going to go this far and we will be provoked, but we will not retaliate, which is remarkable. And that is successful negotiation, because what they're doing is negotiating. They're saying, we want these guys out, but we will not be provoked into doing things that you may want us to do.
This is wisdom itself. You know, it strikes me as you give this advice, this wise counsel, and recount this, Akbar, that this very book is of use not just to the government of Pakistan, but any as you mentioned, the American soldiers, any outsiders who would hope to be influential in these areas. And I think it's a testament, and I suppose this is the question, even for brief comment as we come to the end of our conversation. This is a demonstration of the utility of a discipline like anthropology, is it not?
Yes.
I mean, you wrote this at Princeton.
Yes, I wrote it at Princeton. It was remarkable. I was sitting in Waziristan. I was invited to come to the Institute for Advanced Study in a remarkable letter written by one of the greatest living anthropologists, Clifford Gates, America's greatest anthropologist. And he wrote this remarkable letter saying, this is the institute where Einstein and von Neumann and so on worked and studied and lived, and we would like Akbar Ahmed to join it. So my colleagues in central government thought it was a big joke. They said, what are you doing? Why have you circulated this letter which you've obviously written yourself? Because how could you be with these great people? And I was asking that myself, George. I was saying, well, you know, is this a joke? Is this April was long away with the month of April. And I turned up at Princeton, and the contrast couldn't be greater. Here was a tribal society, fierce, warlike society, and I'm coming to Princeton, this wonderful, almost an island of scholars and thinkers, and these beautiful offices where you could just sit and write, and lakes and walks and so on. And this is where I wrote the book. I mean, this was my first visit to the United States in 1980. And I again thought that somehow if people going out to the tribal world, tribal societies, not just the Muslim world, but places where there are tribal societies, they needed to know something about what we anthropologists call traditional structure, traditional systems, traditional codes, because it would help them. Remember, if you go charging into someone's home and there's a woman there, she may have a taboo in terms of speaking to her. If you pull off her veil, for instance, you're going to antagonize the people, even if you give them $1,000 afterwards. You have antagonized the people and you've lost them. You've lost the battle for the hearts and minds of that society. So a bit of sensitivity, the mosque, religion, women, honor, culture, code, these would help immensely, particularly at this point in history where America is right in the heart of the Muslim world.
You know, I couldn't agree more. And I think what you really do for us is bring home the centrality of history and culture to political events in this world, that there's no running roughshod over them that will ever suffice, that they have to be respected. And that begins with them being understood. Let me ask you this, Akbar, to bring things full circle. There's a lot of talk now, as you know, about the need to democratize societies worldwide. If that is a worthy goal, I suppose that's a question in and of itself, for a place like Waziristan, how would it be achieved? I mean, what would you see as a reasonable sense of what democracy might mean, given all that you've said about the culture?
George, democracy is something that I think the vast majority of the Muslim world would want. There's no escaping this. The tyrants may not want it. Some religious figures may not want it. There may be some excuses. If you talk to the Middle East rulers, they'll say, well, because of Israel, we want to postpone it. If you talk to Pakistanis, they'll say, because of India, we want to postpone it, and so on. The reality is that democracy must come and it has to come. Now, here's the paradox. The tribal areas are the most egalitarian people you will ever find. By definition, you are on the same genealogical charter. If you and I are cousins, you may have risen in the world, you may be a world-famous presenter, which you are, and you a name which you are, but at the same time, we are related on that charter. So we are equal. The sense of being equal is what democracy is all about.
That's right.
And that is very deep in society. And things are run and organized by a council of good people, council of elders, again in that tribal society. So I would say that the outline of democracy is very much there. It isn't so incompatible as we may think.
You know, that's a very valuable thing, and to see if I've been a good student, what you make me aware of, Akbar, is what must be preserved rather than changed as democracy is sought in this region.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, for that and for so much else, and for this book, like all the other books that preceded and others that yet to come from you, thank you so much, my good friend.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it and learned from it.
Always a pleasure, George.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue at wwic.si.edu. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Please join us again right here next week, and thanks for watching. And thank you, Akbar, once again.
Thank you.